this country is at war with Germany.
We shall go on to the end.
I remember the sheets of flame which came up and almost blinded us from our guns.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the World War II podcast. I'm Angus Wallace. As attacks on London by the Luftwaffe became a reality in the summer of 1940, Londoners needed somewhere to shelter from air raids. And so during the Blitz and through to the end of the war, deep level tube stations of London Underground were utilised, sheltering thousands every night. But the role of the Underground is much more complicated. In 1939, the station platforms were never expected to see civilians sleeping there, but rather they were to be kept clear for emergency transportation use. Today I'm joined by Niall Devitt. Niall is the author of Underground Railway, A New History, which is due to be published by Pen and Sword. Thanks for joining me, Niall. I wonder if, before we get to the Second World War, we should start with the First World War. London was targeted by the Germans. Was the Underground used? Did this provide a blueprint to work with in 1939?
Well, basically, the first raids on London are Zeppelin raids, about 1915. In fact, up the road at Clapton are the first deaths from a Zeppelin raid. After Hartlepool and other places have been raided and so on, there's a fear of the beastly Hun. And there's genuine shock and horror that, it can come over and they can hit us. Britain is no longer an island. So the real moment for the Underground, people start going down to the Tube. You've got to bear in mind the Tube at this point is much smaller than the Underground we have today. So entry, particularly in the East End, which naturally the Germans target, is at Liverpool Street. There's no point in hiding on the Metropolitan line. It's not deep enough. You've got to be deep level or deeper. Maybe that's often sometimes psychologically the case, because actually the tunnels of eruption has proven tragically at examples of Bounds Green and Balham, it's not actually that deep. But nevertheless, East Enders start trekking to the Underground, particularly around places like Liverpool Street, so they can get on what was then called the Central London Railway, the Central Rail line to this day. They are encouraged, actually. The posters put up outside Underground stations saying, yeah, you can stay here. Please don't you can even bring your pets at one point, but please be aware of other passengers. And they open them up. At this point, bear in mind, an air raid goes off. There's no siren. So there was Boy Scouts going around on bicycles with klaxons doing this. An awful lot of the systems you see, which will then develop into air raid defence or air raid, are already there in the First World War. Early detection, people looking out, but also getting ready for raid, a warning beforehand. All the things we take, which become later, first warning, second warning, that's already in there. The memory of that endures. People start saying, look, this station's too busy. It's too... there was a wonderful thing I found in the National Archives about a week ago. It's a Metropolitan Police report on behaviour and on the conditions on the Underground. And they're concerned about the fact if one of these stations, which is not that deep, gets hit, a lot of people are going to end up dead. So they recommend a whole series of things in conjunction with what was called the London Electric Railway. That will forget about the ins and outs, but eventually all of it comes together in 1933, called London Transport, which kind of continues to this day, this year. But they are concerned, for example, don't block the spiral staircase. Don't sleep too close to the platform edge. You could fall under a train because the trains are still running during the air raid. As with all of London, London descends, good and bad, down onto the platform. There's a fascinating figure, though. The Metropolitan Police do a head count. I think it's about 1917. It's one of the heavy, November's 1917, I think it is. There's a very heavy Gotha raid. Nothing compared to what's coming later, but nevertheless, at the time, significant. Bear in mind, this is the first mass bombing of the city. And they're not used to this. I mean, it had happened in the Italian wars and so earlier before, but nobody's used to hitting cities. And it's a barbaric behaviour and so. One figure from the Metropolitan Police is fascinating, stands out. Figure of 200,000 people sheltering on the Underground. Now, this is an Underground, which is much smaller. There's no central line east of Liverpool Street. We haven't got down to Morden yet. That's all post-war. It's all the interwar period. So 200,000 people sheltering down there. Now, that's an extraordinary figure. The highest ever on the Underground is 177 on September the 27th, 1940. 177. Now, that's a fascinating point. And I do take it with a pinch of salt, because at least London Transport's particularly good at taking figures and stats. So the figure 177,000 is pretty good. Bear in mind, by next year, it's going down to, it can reach 2,000 at one point. So, you get this sudden burst in 1940. But going back to the First World War, more people, if the Metropolitan Police are, they can't be that wrong. More people are sheltering on the underground in the First World War than the Second. It enters in two ways. Eric Kennington, does a wonderful painting of shelterers at Elephant and Castle. And you can see the women munitions workers in their nut brown smocks. And there's the big pre-war bullseye, solid target bullseyes in the background. It's the Imperial War Museum. I've got it. It's a stunning picture. So already war artists are starting to notice people are sheltering on the Bakerloo in this case. But it becomes part of the consciousness of that memory of that First World War. Now, here's the problem. EastEnders remember that. EastEnders might have learned that that's where you can take shelter. What is happening with regard to government is the potential of air power is now becoming very, very obvious. Be it Billy Mitchell, be it Douay, the theory of the knockout blow.
The bomber will always get through.
Famous for 1934, the whole thing. A couple of years later, well, not necessarily, but this when Baldwin spoke in the House of Commons. This is prior to high-speed monoplanes built out of aluminium, and it's prior to radar being shown to be effective. But nevertheless, it was the case. Also, they don't know that the Germans, this after 33, have got a tactical air force rather than a strategic one. And it's very important. As subsequently, we base our defence on a deterrent system. I mean, it's a wonderful thing, Harold Macmillan, he says in post-war in his biography, we thought of air power in the same way as we now think of nuclear power. It would be the knockout blow. That London would be devastated. We're talking about people providing enough cardboard coffins to bury about 2 million people. London would be so destroyed, as shown in the shape of things to come in 1937. What you've ever seen is that it's an alarming picture. Buses being blown up in Piccadilly Circus, H.G. Wells, and it's still shocking. But they've got enough cardboard coffins to dump bodies off to Tilbury. That is millenarian view of what London will happen if the Germans come. The reality actually is different. Thankfully, I remember this is when I was taught, was that the wrong war at the wrong time. And here's the terrifying: the Germans may not have been trying that hard. And they're still producing fridges and lipstick by 1942. That is the reality. So the fear of a war enters into orbit planning, and it's right across the British government. What are you going to do? Dispersal. The best we can do, get the people out. So you get the blind out, you get children out, and put them into the city, out into the countryside. Health, other things. How are we going to dispose of bodies? And inevitably, the underground gets involved. Now, the fear is London will be so hammered by this knockout blow, which will be over in a couple of hours after they've declared war. It won't be, that's that wonderful moment on the 3rd of September, 1939, when the false alarm, the air raid goes, and there is Neville Chamberlain and Halifax sheltering in the basement, waiting for it to come. In actual fact, it doesn't come, and thank God it didn't. But this affects the attitude to the underground. The attitude is, in a devastated London, you might need the underground to transport troops. Now, if you're going to keep the underground open, the last thing you want is loads of women and children with their baggages, possibly even bring their pets if you're not careful, blocking the underground. So from 1929, the Committee of Imperial Defence basically said, under no circumstances will tube shelter be allowed. There have been experiments in the First World War where they had tested tunnel rings out on Salisbury Plain to see if they would take a blast. And they found they're not actually that resilient. A couple of things. Where the tunnels cross the Thames, if you get a breach down there, you can wipe out the underground. And that's why even through to the 80s, if London flooded, the underground was screwed. So that's why the big thing was to get the Thames barrier. Because if you get water in there, whoop, that's it. It'll be out. I think the minimum they said the underground will be out for at least 6 months to get the water out. So it's vulnerable. A complete list is produced by under the London Passenger Transport of stations which are just too shallow. Hindsight is a wonderful thing. It makes interesting reading. The stations it recommends under no circumstances they should be shelterers are Balham, Bank, Bounds Green, all of which subsequently people died. So a lot of what they're saying is not just being bloody asked. There are practical reasons why you don't want to do it.
The thought about the debts even before the war.
Oh, yeah, all planned. All planned. Typical like Frank Pick. Not just he's a design guru, he's a brilliant, one of the most, if not the most gifted railway manager in history. And he has an attention to detail, he's a statistician, he's a lawyer, and they plan this in absolute detail. Or why they give a very good justification why it's not a good idea.
Well, I was going to say, we shifted 10 million people. Think about the war, and I was actually thinking, as you go to war, the conscription's introduced. London Underground must have had, well, I think I made a note, 8,000 men working just in the repair depots. So if you're having to keep this running to move, well, at the start of the war, moving men around, does working on the underground preclude you from military service? Are you deemed as an essential worker? Because those repair depots must be ideal for tanks and all kinds of other things.
It's based on the scheme of the First World War, and you'll often see it. Unlike former suffragettes handing out white soldiers to people, farm labourers who are actually vital, what you have is a very sensibly, they've learned from the horrible experience of the First World War, where train drivers were absolutely essential to drive people to the embarkation, the British Expeditionary Force, are being attacked, being handed white feathers. So they introduced a wonderful badge called Railway Service. And that's to say, get away, leave them alone, basically. It's a quiet way, he's doing his bit. During the Second World War, an awful lot sign up. It's about 177,000 or something immediately sign up for London Transport. An awful lot of men are brought back out of retirement. And women, it's very important you point that out as well. Without women in London Transport would not have kept going. And a lot of women are able to come into places like Acton Works, and surprise, surprise, you discover they're very, very good at turning axles. They're really, really good machinists. Far less bother than the men sitting there with their hair up, listening to workers' playtime and being very cheerful in a horrible industrial environment, cleaning up a tube train after for its every overhaul, taking the grease and dirt and human skin and hair off the bottom of a tube train. And they get on with it. There would be no, there's that wonderful moment. There's an Eric Kennington, and it makes me tear up when I think about it. He paints a wonderful picture of a female guard with a hand up. And she's got this wonderful London Transport soft felt hat, which is for women, which they introduced. And there she's got the proud London Transport bullseye. And it's like socialist realism. And she puts her hand up and she's just giving the driver the white girl. I get teary when I think about it. It's beautiful because it celebrates a wonderful moment. And Acton Works, the Underground, not just as bus conductors, but doing some really dangerous and heavy work. The Underground would have fallen to pieces. God bless them.
When you're looking at, you talk about repair depots and workshops, does London Underground still have access to all the things it needs to run, or are they, even the same amount of repair depots, or some of the repair depots handed over to, I don't know, Ministry of Works or whatever it is for building tanks? Or
the amazing thing is they did both prior to the Second World War, and you'll see this right across industry. Shadow factory scheme is the case in point. Well, the same goes. Have you got any residual or extra capacity if you needed in a national emergency? Could you provide it? So Acton Works, all the railway works in this country are identified as areas which will be able to do stuff. Well, for example, the building construction of mosquitoes, an awful lot of it is High Wycombe. Why? Because it's furniture. Well, it's the same thing with underground. If you're doing heavy engineering and plate frames for an underground train and repair it, you could do a tank. And here's the lovely thing. Graf Baker, who's the masterman, wonderful man, he sadly died in a freak accident in 1952. He banged his head on a pavement going home. And he designed the modern tube train as we know. But of course, he immediately seconded by the Ministry of Supply. You get you working on tanks, mate. And they do an amazing thing, Acton Works. They did the conversions for the Sherman tanks, the ones that are going to be used in D-Day, for the ones that go on the water, they did 20 of those. And there is a whole list of thousands of rounds of ammunition. During their lunch hour, people would go down Earl's Court. These are men and women. During the lunch hour, they would go into one of the corridors and make munitions. And you see it time and time and time. You also see the decency of the Londoner. You can do the Angus Calder bit about the myth of the Blitz only so far. Yes, you are seeing attempts by both extremes of politics to use tube sheltering for their own thoroughly unpleasant defeatist purposes. Most disgusting in the case of the CPGB, who are basically allied to Nazi Germany at this point.
What's CPD?
Communist Party of Great Britain, who at this point are basically allied to Nazi Germany because of the Nazi-Soviet pact. That's why Harry Pollitt is actually deposed and put by Dutt, who's a complete mentalist, and you want a better phrase. And then you've got BUF.
British Union of Fascists.
British Union of Fascists. You have the horrible situation where one stage, I think it's Mornington Crescent, which has a very prominent Greek Cypriot population. They have living in that area of London. And they have this horrible situation till it's dealt with. And this is where Morrison comes into his own. And also going to Jewish shelterers and saying, don't worry, Hitler will invade, then we'll deal with you. And that's the BUF. So you've got both political extremes. And that's the problem. What happens when tube sheltering happens? I think the first major bombing, that's September 10th, I think it is, a big air raid. And then you get the forcing of the gates at Liverpool Street.
Well, so what causes the change? You know, if the official policy is not to shelter, at what point? They weren't called shelter. What were they called? Squatters? What were they? Squatters.
Squatters.
So the official.
And various other insults.
What causes the change? What's the catalyst for change to allow?
Well, first and foremost, people take the situation into their own rights. First and foremost, they've got that residual memory from the First World War. But Dad went down there in the First World War, so you're not going to that's not going to disappear. Particularly at Liverpool Street, which is the gateway to the Underground for East London. The Underground's not out there yet. There's no Epping yet. They did it in the First World War. Why can't we do it now? They're not interested in what the Imperial Defence have to say about all particularly London Transport and Transport Board. So what they do, they open the gates and push down. Now here's the problem: if you are going to deal with it, and you're going to stick to what has been planned in the event of a bombing raid in London, what are you going to do? These people are sitting down on the platforms. A lot of them are women and children. They're frightened. They're often very poor. They need something to eat. This has never happened. They have been refused proper shelters during the 1930s, the exception of people like the Finsbury Park scheme and Herbert Morrison at the LCC, who've been constantly arguing, build proper, deep shelters for the people. Because something's coming, it's going to be bad. The government has not done anything about it. The reason being, which is what I would describe as a white Marxist argument, that the working classes won't get up and do their duty. Well, the fear is they'll go down, and the word troglodytism comes in, troglodytes. They will go down, they won't fight because they're too terrified, and they won't come back up and do their duty. And this absolutely infests all documentation for the period. You see it at government cabinet level, you see it at London Passenger Transport, you see it Home Office. And it's absolutely this fear that Londoners will break. One, it's a complete underestimate of the value and decency of the London working classes. But two, under attack, people adapt. Individuals can show extraordinary bravery. We look back, and I'm terribly moved if you look at for example, the attack on Sloane Square where a train is hit. And you see these very old men climbing over the red drapery. The girders coming down at this point, climbing over the wreckage to try and get people out the front car. And these men, it's 60. It makes me cry when I think about it. It's the bravery of these people. And they're underestimated. And that's the big thing. So they're sitting on the platform. They've got their bag and they've got their children. So, right, what are you going to do? Are you going to send the brigade of guards down to get them off the platforms? At which point you have handed the greatest propaganda victory to Goebbels and the CPGB you could imagine. By the way, at this point, the CPGB, via the Daily Worker, is agitating furiously. This could be the spark. Well, that's the problem. Does the government, and this is where John Anderson, Minister of Home Security, and later Herbert Morrison realised, if you don't organise this, if you try to kick the people off, it's a disaster. If you don't organise it properly, ticket it, turn it into something positive, take a negative and turn it into a positive, the Communist Party of Great Britain will run it for you. And you'll see spontaneous shelter committees turning up. And that's the fear. And Morrison's big fear is if we don't reverse this, one, we're guilty. We did not provide proper shelter for these people.
There's a class thing going on as well.
Oh, yeah, it's explicit. that's why mass observation is so useful in this, because what they do is they particularly observe. They are writing down. Often they are from very well-to-do Hampstead with a pencil and paper, and they're wonderful. I've been down to Mass Observation Archive at Sussex. Wonderful staff at Sussex, just like the wonderful staff at National Archive. And you see these very hastily scrabbled in pencil notes. What do you feel about being a troop shelterer? And it's pissed off. I'm trying to get a night's sleep. They were called Cooper Snoopers at this point, Ministry of Information stuff. But they're an amazing resource. And there was a lovely one. I said, yeah, I know it's smelly, it's not so, but I feel safe. And the ability just to get a few hours kit. But the explicit class bias against the working classes of London.
Well, it's the fact that the Anderson shelter, which is synonymous with the Blitz, is two weeks' wages to purchase, which I hadn't quite appreciated.
I know. Or the Morrison shelter, which is quickly, you know about a Morrison shelter, is a cage.
Is that the table cage thing?
You sit under the table. I mean, it's 2 ticks up from hiding under the table.
Yeah, I'm frightfully intrigued to see how many people actually purchased one, because they're a funny size.
I'm sure it exists. I'm actually, next time maybe I'll have a look for you. It'll be Ministry of Supply or something we can find.
Because they're always in the museums, but I've never spoken to anyone who remembers actually seeing one for real. That everyone's just aware of them.
It becomes an absolute vignette of the Second World War. If you think of London, you think of crowded tube platforms. But also, who's watching at this point? The Americans. The French have just thrown in the towel after 6 weeks. What is the point in sending an awful lot of arms and goods to the British if they're going to do a compromise peace? And they are not stupid. They've got the FBI around them. They know full well that Halifax and people, and Rab Butler in particular, are doing things they shouldn't be. That wonderful book, which is 12 Days in May, I think it is, which shows how close Churchill had to do, at least promise you, well, but if we fight on, we might get a better peace from the Bath. And it's only really, this is often forgotten, it's only really the stalwart support of Ernest Bevin and Clement Attlee that saved Churchill. Churchill, ironically, depended upon the Labour Party, not the Conservatives. And with that wonderful moment, I have nothing, that magnificent, beautiful speech, I have nothing to offer. It's Labour who get up and do their speech, but the backbench Conservatives, the Conservatives are completely silent. And that's the problem. The Americans are watching. So you have this Emeroys, Harry Hopkins. Later, Wendell Willkie will be sent over. And Wendell Willkie, he visits the model tube shelter, which is Aldwych. Aldwych is a model tube station for the very simple fact there are no trains running. So you can control access in and out. So that's where they take the foreign dignitaries. That's where they take Wendell Willkie to show it. And that's where George Formby plays. You control access in and out. The City of Westminster run it, not London Transport. Bear in mind, most of the food and facilities are local authorities. So if you want to know about Westminster, Aldwych Tube Station, get yourself down to the brilliant Westminster Archives. Adrian Alton and the team down there, they are wonderful people, and they'll tell you all about it. It's a model, and that's where you take your diplomats. That's where you take your ambassadors.
Is that where all those newsreels are filmed with George Formby? Because there is a specific sort of Blitz spirit kind of we'll muddle through aspect to those newsreels that are quite chipper and optimistic.
And good cheers and everything. I showed you on tube snacks. And good cheers to you. At the end of it, please don't, for God's sake, don't sleep too close to each other because we could have plague here. I mean, there's a wonderful document from I think it's Conservative Plague. We're not careful. We don't organise. We'll end up with typhoid and cholera passing around here.
How do they organise the stations? You know, because there's a sort of, if you don't think about it, you assume that people just turn up with a sort of bedroll and find a space to go to sleep. You'll have too many people in one place, and then if there's toilets. I mean, when you start thinking about it, if people have done this, toilets, food.
It's an enormous undertaking. Well, what you've got to do, first of all, it's underground. They've got some semblance of normality has to think. First one is to get some toilets in, Eslan flushable toilets, because the platform conditions are horrific. To introduce some basic rules, you can turn up at 4 o'clock and get into the station. There's a line. Now, before a certain time, it's about 7 o'clock, you can't go beyond that line because the trains are running. Then after that, at a certain time, once the last train to go, you can even sleep on the train if there's a train on the platform. So a degree of organisation starts to emerge. And here's the good thing about London Transport. It's organisationally very strong. The proof of that is the fact, it can produce munitions, it can adapt tanks, it can build bloody aircraft. It's a wonderful organisation. and it's public sector, and it has the ability to sort things out because it's organisation. So they get, right, let's get some toilets down there. We ticket the people. We get the local authorities come in. People like the Salvation Army help on getting down there. The Quakers help. Catholic, in the case of Mornington Crescent, the local Greek priest comes, the Orthodox priest comes down and helps. And a semblance of normality starts to emerge. This is about by October. Still, there is that overriding fear that if they're not careful, if the London Passenger Transport Board and local authorities and the government, in inverted commas, do not control that, somebody else is going to control it for them. But that will not be positive because it's the CPGB, Communist Party of Great Britain, the Daily Worker. I mean, this is the point where they're thinking of banning the Daily Worker. Morrison wants to later on. That's why he's a hate figure to this day on the hard left, because he was a democratic socialist. And he had a track record. You see, why Morrison so important is this. Unlike Anderson, unlike Churchill and so on and so forth, he could talk with credibility. He'd been right about evacuation. The government was very reluctant to introduce the evacuation scheme in 1939. He goes into 10 Downing Street and says to Sir Horace Wilson, get on with it, and actually swears, tell Neville, get the evacuation scheme going. With that war is basically going to start. Oh, and Horace Wilson says, oh, no, give it a little bit more. No, get on with it. And they did this extraordinary moment where London transports thousands and thousands of the most vulnerable in British society. And again, the fear of the knockout blow is all ever present in the evacuation scheme. So all the children, these poor kids going off to the West Country for safety. So they get all the children and they get sent to Ealing Broadway, Richmond and Watford, out of the area. And they do that by underground, by trolley bus, by Green Line coach to get them out to safety. The reason fear is that the major termini of London, Paddington, Waterloo, will be wiped out. So the underground becomes very important. But again, Morrison had been right. Get on with it. Morrison had said, build shelters. He'd done that from the LT. Nobody listened to him. And he said, no, you've got to do this. And then the mess of what happens in September 1940, the gates push forward. Oh, screw this. I'm not going to bloody burn here. I'm going down. The government has to catch up quickly. Now, give Churchill his due. Tell me more about this tube sheltering. He'd initially said, no, absolutely, you can't. He said it in cabinet. You cannot have this. This is defeatism. They won't come back up. Again, a completely and totally disgraceful attitude towards the working classes of London. And then he turns around and says, tell me, is there any way you can organise this? Surprise, surprise. And sure enough, literally over a 24-hour period, this is in September, around September 5th, up to the point, September 10th, London Transport are told, could you organise this? And guess what? All the stuff from the First World War is polished off. A brilliant former retired manager who retired in 1937 called J.P. Thomas is brought out of retirement. And London Transport feels a little bit battered from the whole experience. You can tell it when you read the correspondence of Frank Pick and Ashfield. But they do it, and they stop complaining, and they do it brilliantly.
We're going to take a short break. We'll be back with you in a moment. Welcome back. I'm talking to Niall Devitt about London Underground during World War II. Are all stations designated as shelters? How do they, what are they excluding and what are they customising in?
Well, what's called subsurface. There's two types of underground. You can even see the two types of underground train. There are subsurface lines, which are just basically they dug up the road, put a railway down, then put the road back on top. Then there are deep stations, which are the deep level, which are tunnels using what's called a great edge shield. Now, that's the difference. People know from hard experience, there's no point in sheltering at Westbourne Park. It's in the open and so forth, at places like Sloane Square. So it will be like it is in the First War, the places that matter are central London.
So do they close these, I would say cut and fill stations, obviously Hammersmith, those Sloane Square?
Well, they kept going. No, they keep running the service, trying in the midst of the Blitz.
But do they close them for people sheltering? Is if someone saying you can't shelter, get out?
They don't really need to do it. I think a degree of common sense comes into it. It's like if you are Hammersmith on the district in Piccadilly or on the Hammersmith City, you're not in the tunnel. The tunnel sections are like tunnels on a mainline railway. They're not deep at all. So people come into it. There are exceptions. The East London line, for example, and down in Surrey Docks and stuff like that, in the tunnels, that people will shelter them. But no, because as proven by the examples of strikes on Moorgate, strikes on King's Cross, strikes on Sloane Square, the subsurface is extremely vulnerable. So they're basically effectively useless as shelters. What are useful is the deeper, the tube railways, as in proper tube railways built from about 1890 onwards. The Northern Line, the Bakerloo, the Piccadilly, and the Central. They are the lines because they go down deeper. Look, 3/4 of the Underground doesn't run in tunnel. It runs out in the open. That's the fun bit, basically. But it kind of self-evident, and they know where to go. But it's about organising. And London Transport throws itself into a brilliant Sir Lord Ashfield. Not only is he fun, he is also good-humoured. He would be able to go up to the ticket collector or to the driver, the motorman, in the case of the Underground, full motorman, shake his hand and talk completely at ease. He was a people person. He had people skills. We would recognise that. He's a rotten golf player, but he plays golf. Absolutely hopeless. But at his golf course, don't worry, you'll have the chance to second playing golf. He will be around at the and he's able to put the interests of London Transport and the Underground forward. And when it came to contacting, making a series of phone calls, right, we've got a problem here. Can you get JP out of retirement? Right, get him out. I'm contacting Lord Wilton, right? He'll sort something out on the food. We'll take it here. We'll do this. Boom, boom, boom. And it's done. I say London Transport. It's not just the bravery of the ordinary staff going off so many, Lancaster pilots and stuff. It's just wonderful. It's just the sheer ability of the organisation. And we all complain about, my bus is late. Oh, saving virtue of London. Absolute saviour is London Transport in World War II. And they say finest out. Yeah, that's it.
You've alluded to some stations being hit. Balham, with the famous picture of the giant crater and the bus in it. But the worst loss of life on the Underground wasn't actually caused by a bomb, was it? It's at Bethnal Green. I was going to say, well, tell us about Bethnal Green. Why is it even chosen as a station?
Well, there's great pressure. Again, this is great pressure to be seen to do something in 1940 because the government has singly done nothing to protect its own citizens. So a list is drawn up of places that could be used. And what was part of the New Works programme would have seen the Central Line opening up not that long after, but for the war, through Bethnal Green out to what is Epping and Hainault now these days. So the station tunnels are all built, the running tunnels done and so on and so forth. So the station's about to open but doesn't. And as a result of which, people go down, well, could you use this? And you could probably get about 4,000 people down. Now, we're talking big. At this point, they've got 3-tier bunks being fitted and medical centres, age centres, food is available. There's 1,000 staff employed just to feed people. You have to bring your own tin mug at this point, by the way. That's the rules. Now, the idea sounds a great idea. It's not. The problem is it's the second worst shelter in London. The station is not, it has one single entrance. It's an area which has always been problematic. A lot of the documents were closed on Bethnal Green until come very, very recently. And the reason is there is nobody who emerges from that evening looking well. It is the mother of all sorts. It's so, a lot of it, when I was going through the doc, I actually go sit down and have a coffee after. It's horrific. Nobody emerges well apart from the poor women and children, mainly women and children who died that night, and their families who have suffered to this day. But there's an awful lot of mythology and an awful lot of agendas with regard to Bethnal. And that is something which I think people have to be aware of. It's a lot to do with the identity of people today, an awful lot to do with the day, not with them. If it was a cover-up, it wasn't a very good one, because there is a court case in 1944 in Birmingham where all the details basically are delivered. This is the period where life is much cheaper than we would expect now, disgustingly so cheap, I would argue. But you've got a world war going on. Bethnal Green, I'm amazed it didn't happen earlier, the disaster at Bethnal Green. The station should never have been opened. It wasn't appropriate. We've got major problems at that station. There is a wonderful bureaucratic triangle between the London Passenger Transport Board, who are obsessed with the issue of a bulb. There's only one single light bulb down this one stairway, which doesn't have a central rail. They're obsessed with in case the German bombers can see that raid, can see the bulb. They're not concentrated. In fact, this is an inadequate shelter for the number of people you're going to shelter down them. The other problem is behaviour within the shelter itself. There's a lot of youths who are behaving very badly. So much so they've been threatening the wardens. There's a knifing down there. There's theft from the canteen. It's not a happy shelter. Prior to the Second World, it had been a hotbed of political radicalism, CPGB versus BUF, disproportionate vote in 1937 for the British Union faction. Still a minority of people there, of decent people around Cambridge Heath. It should never have been given the clear, mainly because it sounds a great idea, but the facilities are not there. London Transport Board are worried about a light bulb instead of concentrating on the problem with the local council, who are saying, put a bloody handrail down there because somebody's going to trip. On top of that, you've got a lot of agitation going on against Morrison because the Communist Party don't like Morrison. Morrison has appointed an awful lot of cronies from the London Labour Party who are not trained properly as wardens. They're all over in the pub on the night. And then you have the problem of an awful lot that the shelter is basically being taken over by local youth. A lot of the people at the time, if you look at the transcripts, are using the phrase, well, they're avoiding national service. The people draft dodging. Now, that is not to say everybody was like that. But you chuck little incidentals like that, put it together, and you've got a disaster. It's made worse in one sense because Lady Mountbatten turns up about a couple of months earlier, and everything looks fine. And it looks great for the event, for the inspection. But nobody has put that central rail down there. And London Transport blaming the local council, London Transport's blaming the Home Office. It's a classic bureaucratic tactic.
So what happens that night of 3rd of March 1943?
What happens is the local artillery are going to practice without telling anybody in Victoria Park anti-aircraft barrages. This is 1943. Now, the night before, the RAF had raided Berlin. And after the Baedeker raids, the fearing is if you hit Berlin, they'll hit you back. Revenge attacks, Baedeker raids, Exeter and Canterbury. You hit Dresden, you hit Hamlin, we'll set fire to Exeter. So the fear is there's been a very successful raid the night before, Lancashire, Stirling, and so forth, over Berlin, comparatively successful. So there is a feeling the Germans might hit back. So there's a nervousness in the air. That night, the local artillery, they decide to test their guns. So people think, oh, God almighty, after a long break, the bloody Luftwaffe is back. They're bombing us. The barrage went up. People think, God, what's that? What's that? Just as a cinema was opening, just as the trolley bus is pulled up outside, electric bus, and then suddenly you get this crush to get down to the station. A woman with a baby trips at the bottom of the stairs. People keep pushing forward in the bad illumination and with nowhere to scoot. She'd fallen with a baby. And basically you end up with a pile of bodies in a space which is tiny. I can't be clear, but it's meters wide. They suffocate. It's horrific what happens. This is where you get into why an awful lot of this is held back, was held back, though a lot of the details are already out. If you read the ambulance reports, it takes them an inordinate amount of time to get into the station. They talk about having to push youths away from the entrance, trying to get to the situation, to get the body. It takes, I think the crack is early in the evening. It's not till about 12 o'clock at night they finally get all the bodies out. Something has gone very badly wrong there.
Yeah, there's 172 crushed to death.
107 crushed to death. They're asphyxiated. I think they only find 2 broken bones, or so 2 or 3 broken bones. Because I've read the autopsy things and so forth. What is fascinating is that it's always been projected. It was murder. It wasn't murder. It was just a classic British cock-up. In this country, unfortunately, you always have to kill people first before you learn it. There'd been a crush already at Elephant and Castle. But at least at Elephant Castle, there were barriers to hold back the worst. What happens at Bethnal Green is institutional lack of cooperation from the highest level, a feeling that these people are the worst shelters, so therefore they're not going to bother, not that important. a false idea that the worst of the raiding is over. In fact, the V1s and V2s prove that's not the case at all later on. And just bureaucratic bloody indifference. Oh, and also they have that as ever, and you read through the papers, they've got a wonderful scapegoat called the Jews. And that is the reason I'm fairly certain an awful lot of this was held back, because nobody looks good. In reality, there are no Jewish people at that station that night at all. And give the permanent secretary at I can't remember his name now, at the Home Office, he says no in paperwork. There was an emergency meeting called the Bethnal Green Town Hall, and already rumours have been spread it was Jews. Pushing and shoving. Complete nonsense. And he writes in the back, no, I'm not having that. And then it is very clearly stated in the inquiry, no Jews at all were at the station. There is no evidence. This is disgusting. This is not acceptable. Stop it. And it comes from the warders, and it comes from not all the people who are just devastated and horrified at what has just happened. They've lost their children, for God's sake. But it absolutely permeates paper. It's quite revolting to read it. And you see it, boom, boom, boom. That night, a night later, Radio Hamburg reports there's been a crush. And they don't want to hand. One of the reasons a lot of it's held back, what would Goebbels have made of that? That's the reason. It was covered up. No. There's a bloody good reason. This is pre-D-Day Britain. That's why they're holding it back. If they're holding it, and they're not even very good at holding it. The most horrifying thing I found was the anti-Semitism. Now, that is not to say that the good people of Cambridge like that, but it's a problem. And it's proven in 1937, the highest vote for the BUF in the whole of Britain. This is the reality. The vast majority of tube sheltering, you can look back and say, yeah, it's not bad. Bethnal Green, there's no winners. None at all. Government indifference to the people of London, some very revolting reviews, and only an idiot would start firing stuff without telling anybody. I mean, it gets worse afterwards. I mean, naturally, the CPGB start showing children in cinemas and pubs to raise money so they can sue Admiral Evans and Lord and Herbert Morrison. That stuff is why it was held back. It's not a pleasant story. They were let down. It has to be contextualized. It has to be explained. But Bethnal Green is just horrific. It's the worst civilian disaster of World War II.
That shelter holds 4,000. But they, as someone who used to live on the Northern Line, that's a big shelter. But they what about what they do? Let me get this straight. Clapham, is it Clapham North, Clapham Common, Clapham South? Well, what I'm fascinated about are these shelters that they build, because I was told, they're platforms for express trains. Are these?
They're the deep levels, yeah, special shelters.
So were these super shelters that they were building at those three stations?
That's a bit of an excuse to get London Transport to cough up and build them. They don't know in 1940, later 1940, that Barbarossa is coming, and that the Luftwaffe is going to be diverted over to hitting Russia. So the fear is that this is going to be prolonged. We've got to protect our own people again. Let's try and make good all the things we didn't do in the interwar period, which is build proper deep shelters. And the scheme is basically for 10 shelters built alongside the Northern Line. And they are mainly there to carry, basically to shelter 100,000 people in theory. It's reduced down to 10,000 per shelter. In the end, it's reduced down to 8,000.
That's still a lot of people.
It's a lot of people. Two of the big shelters are dropped off. One of them was going to be at St. Paul's, but the problem is they discovered that burying under the foundations of the St. Paul's is probably not a good idea, because, I mean, with regard to wartime morale, St. Paul's collapsing into the central line is probably not a good idea. But they build them. They have the mini Blitz and so on and so forth. But they're kept as what was called a strategic reserve. And the numbers going to be put down are reduced over time. So I think it's about 40,000 at the end. By the way, at this point, the American Army, very interested in using one around Gooch Street, which became later the Eisenhower Center. And that's where Eisenhower and the people planning D-Day are going to be going. And they're used for everything. But the idea is we'll keep it a strategic reserve because we might need it. They never actually really got used for what they were meant to. The first one, GIs on staying in London on leave, you can stay there. My dad stayed there, actually. And Americans who were given by the American Red Cross free ticket and a tube map. And go and see American British culture. Go on. And they do, God bless them. And they can They can stay up at Good Street, or they can stay up in one of the shelters. So they open them up for those. They're finished about 1943, most of 43, 45. They never really get used for their initial purpose because until the V1s and V2s, but that, in the scheme of things, is not that long. You see suddenly the underground becoming very busy again. But these are deep level. Post-war, they come into various. There were post 1946 various plans to build express tubes and the underground to anywhere and everywhere. Well, yeah, but often when you're building something at short notice, you're often justifying it to the Treasury. The Treasury will have said, well, what the hell are you going to do with it afterwards? Yeah, right. And they're basically big tube tunnels. There's 3 levels, and you've got 3 tier bunks in them. They've got kitchens, they've got anti-gas. They're perfect ones. They've got kitchens, they've got anti-gas treatment and housing, so you can't gas come in. Separate air supply, separate electricity. Very, great in theory. Never actually got really used. They had various purposes. The theory was in the Cold War that London could survive. The tube system might be able to survive an atomic attack. Of course, thermonuclear world, it becomes increasingly apparent this is not the case. But they want to work out how far out. Okay, you drop a 2 megaton bomb on London. How far out? What would survive? Is Arnish Grove operational? Okay, good. So take it as a given that Trafalgar Square and Strand stations are finished. Okay, but Bounds Green. William Strang has written in 1957 the blueprint of a nuclear attack on London. And it was kept secret for many years. And basically, he concludes that the idea that it's going to be Dad's army and civil defence guys running around with, you say, go down to shelter. Don't even think about it. It's not going to happen. And he concludes that London devastated. But they're not quite sure about it. So in 1966, now this is a secret document, I still think it's closed. It's to do with a wonderful thing in the National Archives, which I leapt at when I saw it. A test on underground stations in the event of the thermonuclear strike. Now, I had a look at this and I thought, well, okay. Guess what? It's closed. There's a surprise. And it's called Distant Learning or Distant Love. Anyway, they built a half-sized tube station in Alberta in Canada in 1966. And other building. And it's a NATO exercise. They blow it up, thankfully using conventional. And guess what they conclude? No, it's not going to survive a nuclear attack. And from that point onwards, you see Dennis Seeley's defence review. It's the only hope we've got, rather like the situation in the 1920s and 30s with regard to air defence, that deterrence is the only hope in a nuclear war. Well, just with air war, if we go back to the premise that there's no point in preparing for this, you're screwed. What you've got to do is make sure they never want to do it. Roy Jenkins, as Home Secretary, basically says, I am disbanding the Home Civil Defence. It's bloody pointless.
And is that's where the civil defence role of the London Underground sort of becomes mothballed?
It's non-existent from that point onwards.
But there are stations that we can still visit and see, isn't there? Some of them have been now opened up.
Yeah, they are. They were all sold off about 90. When the Cold War ended, had been part of what had been the Ministry of Works. They've been passed around. The Underground never used them. And they were used for various...
Oh, they didn't belong to London? I assume London Underground owned them all.
Ministry of Works owned them, and they had access to them, and so on and so forth. Well, they weren't any use. I mean, what's a load of bunk beds? So they were used for various purposes for the Ministry of Works. And then in 97, the files, again, some of them are open, on selling them off to private opportunities and stuff. You can visit down there. I think it's Clapham South or whatever. It's very interesting because it's organised, very London transport. It's very got Ashfield all over it. Signage, restaurant room, and so on and so forth. Its usefulness as a shelter for Londoners stopped in the thermonuclear period. There is genuine thought that possibly you could use it for the atomic era. I mean, don't forget that a lot of the buildings during World, such as Down Street, where Churchill sheltered there for the grand total of 3.5 weeks. That is not, complete bullshit. That is not Churchill's tube station. You couldn't get into the shelter at the best of times. He's not at Down Street. He's there for about 3.5 days at most. He hates the Underground. Why? The trains end late, and the best he's going to get is about 4 hours sleep in a dusty tunnel. because the first train's be about 5:15 anyway, 5:30. So you can't get him to shelter. He doesn't like the underground. He has to. What he does do, though, with Down Street, he sends very tired staff who are working under pressure, because he is a demanding man, very demanding. You get at moments of great little gestures. And one of his great gestures, are you tired? Right, get yourself down to Down Street. Now, the wonderful thing about Down Street, tube station, which is used by the railway executive, which is running the four main railways and London Transport, it is the precursor of what will become the British Railways Board. It's very near the Savoy, and there is. So, staff at Downing Street have been living off tinned beans, sausages, and soup. They're sleeping in sleeping bags. Terrible existence at Town Downing Street. R&R for them is send them down Street. So they have bottles of champagne, very nice food, bit of character. I mean, totally wrong. And ordinary Londoners will have all this outrage. So you send them down there, and there's that wonderful moment where Ernie Bevan gets caught in the lift at Down Street. He's had a few, and it's for tired ministers. You should go down there and have a bit of the party. But the idea that's Churchill's tube station, I think that's marketing gone mad.
Down Street is one of the tubes that's visitable. You can visit Down Street, isn't it? It's one of Clapham South, Down Street.
Yes, it is. It's totally strict. My dad, when he was on the underground, had keys for it, so I was able to go down there many years ago. And in those, there was a bit left now. There's very little to see. I think you pay an awful lot of money, and there's a great stroke of the imagination to imagine it. If I was going, I'd go to the Cabinet War Room. So then Churchill didn't go to Cabinet War Rooms that much, and you couldn't get him to shelter.
I have to say, I before we started, I was looking at how much it costs to go to Clapham South, because I moved out of Clapham just as they opened them up, and it is expensive.
Well, I'll put it this way: be aware, it's an awful lot of money for not actually that much, and also it kind of distorts underground history. If you want to see some cracked tiling, some dusty, there's a touch of Mystery Museum and Scooby Doo to it, history. Oh, look, we're going to find something. No, And if you want to see really nice tiling, go to Covent Garden Tube Station. It's still intact. I mean, it's interesting, disused tunnelways and passageways, but that is not really the history. If you're not mentioning the deep politics of tube sheltering and how seriously they come, this is potentially very dangerous. I mean, look, also you've got to put it in context. We now see it as this amazing moment in London history, cheery cockneys on the platforms. It's not like Angus Calder trying to say, oh, no, it was awful. It's somewhere between. London has held, they did hold, and they were very brave, and they did amazing things. The people at Bethnal Green who lost their mums and their children to this day suffer from what, but great dignity in what has happened. And they got them at Memorial, and bloody right too. But let's put this into perspective. How many people, as a proportion of Londoners, are sheltering on the underground in 1940? How many do you think, roughly, Angus? 4% at most. You get from 177,000, which is a pretty accurate figure. I think it's 27th of November, 1940. It plummets down to about 2,000 in 1943. And a lot of those people are homeless. A lot of those people are getting, good luck to them. And a lot of those people who don't want to go to a rest centre. In 1940, on VE Day, there was about 12 people still down at Aldwych Station. I mean, it's rather sad, actually. Can you imagine what their VE Day was like? But don't forget, Westminster Council, brilliant provider, but it's a model. Don't forget, every time you'll always see Aldwych Tube Station. In the ground total scheme, tube sheltering is a blip. It's a tiny ripple, but disproportionate political importance. 17% of shelterers are in Morrison's and stuff. 65% of people in London just staying at home. And the thing is, from the mass observation files, which are the most wonderful, pure primary history. As I say, when I've been writing I have gone back. I have not used secondary sources. Always go and find something else. Stuff you wouldn't think, like not just the newspaper, unusual stuff. Local print, local archives, Lambeth, Hammersmith and Fulham. By the way, with regard to going back to the story of forcing the gates in 1940, here's another problem. What the hell do you do for a mother and child at Holland Park buy a tuppenny ticket, get on the train, and just stay on the train travelling up and down. They're sheltering. So wouldn't it be a good idea, rather than the Communist Party of Great Britain or, God forbid, the BUF, London Transport organise it? And they do it very well. But in the scheme of protecting in London, disbursement is more important. And the attitude of those people who are not using the tube is contemptuous at times to those who are using the tube. They're down as smelly, tube rats, vermin, dirty Jews, always. You always get that one. And the mass observation, it's again, what you forget is how prevalent anti-Semitism is at that point. Completely disgusting.
Presumably, these the people in the tubes are from areas where the housing is there's a lot of people in small areas. It's not the suburbs of Chiswick and Balham, which are houses with gardens. And
it's exactly that. But also it's areas which have been completely neglected when it comes to basic any form of provision. The handling out of Anderson shelters is bloody late in the day. You see it. And it disproportionately affects upon those people from the poorest areas, often East End. Refugees, I mean, as I say, there are also lovely stories. There are beautiful things in the story. There's horrible things like the tragedy of Bethnal Green or Bounds Green. All the people who were sheltering at Bounds Green were Belgian, and they were Belgian refugees. It's so sad. And they were killed because the tunnel barely is beneath the surface. And you could say, lovely London Transport, God bless them, to this day, do respect it. So you do see a plaque. Just like recently they did one for TfL, God bless TfL. They did a wonderful plaque for COVID transport workers. And they've just unveiled it. It's lovely.
Well, I used to pass the Balham one every day, commuting to work for the...
And Balham's horrific. What happens there is so... I mean, can you imagine that? I think 79 people. I can't remember.
They drown in the tube when the
gas main, water main goes, the whole
goes, and they're down there.
Have you seen the photos, Groff, of what it looked like?
Yeah.
There are, and it's up. The silt is up to the horrible, horrible thing. But yet you see lovely things at like Essex Road. 4 children are baptised there on the platform by a local vicar because they have to. They said, and there are beautiful things like. I mean, okay, we all laugh at George Formby, God bless him. He gets down to Aldwych. And it's important, it's filmed. By the way, all the time, FDR has been sent pictures of these things. So Wendell Willkie, God bless him, who has been basically blackmailed to come over, is sent down. And he reports back to Congress, and that's the Londoners can take it. I was on the underground, and they were there. And it's important because they are really worried. Are we about to give in? Well, 1, they underestimated the working classes of London, and 2, they underestimated the ability of London Transport to turn a negative into one of the most wonderful positives of the underground. Tiny number of people really involved in the scheme of things. You take a negative, you turn it into a positive, and you turn it into something you're genuinely proud of.
Very good. It does make you think. Thank you, Niall. Loyal listener, Niall's forthcoming book is Underground Railway, A New History. It is due for release soon, unless you are listening in the future, and it's available now. If you have enjoyed this episode of the podcast and would like to show your support for the show for a small monthly sum, you can sign up as a patron, which helps me find the time to put the podcast together. There are various levels of patronage, starting at the lowest level where a Patreon will be given a custom RSS feed so you can listen to the podcast advert free. At another tier, you'll get extras, pieces of interview that never quite made it into the final cut. So to sign up, head to patreon.com/WW2podcast. Now that is all for this episode. I might manage to squeeze in an extra episode this month. If I don't manage that, I'll be back with Mark Stilley to discuss Let It Go. Until then, I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.
Jerry 88mm gun hit our town, blew us the hell out of it.
Stalingrad can never be repaired.
As Allied Commander-in-Chief, I have granted a military armistice.